on the autism spectrum or from the perspective of the family members. Because I think we as professionals can learn so much from hearing from the other side of the table, that perspective of living with autism. And so I'm gonna take some time here. I really want this to be kind of informal, just a conversation between us and the panel here. So they did get information ahead of time on the types of questions we're going to ask, so that they can be thinking and really considering what's going to be really helpful to us as parents and professionals to learn from their experience as well. So I'm going to start our conversation off. If each of you would take a moment just to introduce yourselves, tell us your name, where you're from, and a little bit about you or your child. So I'll give it over to you.
Well, I'm Michelle Lamson. I'm from, I live in Washburn, Wisconsin, about 6 blocks from the shore of Lake Superior. Yes, it's gorgeous. You guys got to come visit sometime. I have 2 children, a 20-year-old son who is moderately autistic and has some intellectual, handicaps. And then I have a 15-year-old daughter who is mildly autistic, and she is severely hearing impaired since birth. And she's the one I'm mainly, when I answer questions, I'm mainly going to be referring to because there's a particular emphasis that I want to make.
My name is James Williams. I am an adult self-advocate with autism. I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 3, and I travel around the country to give presentations on autism at a wide variety of different events. I'm also the author of several books related to autism that I am going to be selling after the panel. We all have to support ourselves somehow, but I'm here to talk about what it's like to have autism, but not just what it's like to have autism, but what are some of the different issues that people with autism have in different parts of America? Because one of the things I've learned when I travel is that every state provides services differently. Every state treats their residents with autism differently. And traveling has really given me a perspective on the fact that, autism is such a behavioral disorder, and every state has different types of people, different values people might have. And if you really want to take a look at autism, you can't just look at the behaviors at face value. You have to look at how people in your community, in your neighborhood, are viewing the behaviors of a person with autism and how that impacts their existence. So thank you, and I'm really honored to be on this panel today.
Off on my phone, and that's my alarm to pick up my son from school, because this is our first week of school, so I'm Rosalie Toko, and I am parent of Nicholas and Joseph. Nicholas is the child that brings me here. He has autism, classic autism, and so this really threw me off, I'm sorry. I hope someone's picking him up in Bayside, Wisconsin. Otherwise I should get up and drive and get him now. And I am also a consultant with Aspire Education Consulting, and I specialize in parent mentoring. I don't speak in front of audiences very often. I'm more of a listener and an observer, so this is a little bit of a challenge for me, so I hope you'll just be understanding and gracious. So Nicholas is 18, he has classic autism, he's had a boatload of intervention, and he's a 5th-year senior at Nicolay High School and is doing very well for himself considering the depth and breadth of his challenges.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today and sharing your stories. social experiences of individuals who are experiencing autism. So I want to start our conversation off by giving each of you a chance to share, if you'd like, about a specific situation where there were some social struggles. And if you can talk a little bit about what were the supports that you had or your child had. What worked, what didn't, what would have made it better in that particular situation. And I will ask just for volunteers if you would like to share your story.
So I asked Nick this question, so I don't really want to only bring my voice to this conversation, but his also. And he reports that he is unaware of any social struggles. So perhaps there's something protective about his perspective. But I have been able to observe him a lot in the school setting because I was the parent volunteer in the cafeteria and on the playground. And one thing that I observed early on is that he would walk the peripheries of the playground, scripting and monologuing and acting out his whatever was going on in his head. I talked to the school about that, and they said, oh, kids need that time. They need that time to be themselves and blow off steam, and that's true to some extent. I also asked Nick in a roundabout way, hey Nick, so not a direct ask and not all at once, but as part of an ongoing longer conversation. How are things going on the playground? Sometimes I see you over there. And he said, and I wanted to capture this quote, and this was in middle school, so years ago, he said, I just walk around by myself like an idiot. So he's very aware that something that he's doing, that he was doing was different, and that was an expression of wanting to really, I walk around by myself like an idiot, wanting to make a connection, but not knowing how. So my husband and I have always maintained that for our child at least, recess is the hardest class. So I could have used more support from the school in nurturing those social skills and making connections among his peers and himself. So that's the social challenge that I've witnessed, among some others, but that's the biggest one I wanted to bring, especially to the teachers.
One challenge that was pretty apparent growing up was the issue of never understanding throughout my educational career many of the unwritten rules that other kids expected me to know, but very few adults or even teachers or social workers knew. And one of the things that I think people forget is that, while the teacher is in charge of the classroom, while the principal might be in charge of the school, teachers do not have authority over the social order of their school. Every school has a social order that is governed by the students that determines who's popular, who isn't, who's accepted, and who isn't. And one mistake that is often made, and this mistake I saw made a lot by my teachers, is that teachers often will try to impose their social ideology when helping students with autism find friends, not realizing that the real way you help kids with autism with social issues is by finding out what the social order is and working with it. I remember once when in high school, I had the luxury of having a girl become my friend and coach me on social issues. And I told her about how I was required by my IEP to learn social skills from a social worker who knew nothing about the social work at my high school. And I said to her, you know, what can I do to understand how to fit in? And she said, well, the first thing is don't listen to a word that social worker tells you, because she has no idea how the social order works and never will if she's not willing to listen to the other students. And there were certain infractions I made that the teachers were oblivious to. For example, like many other kids with autism, I enjoyed and still enjoy going swimming. I'm sure we hear a good deal about, you know, look for water if you have a kid that elopes and all that. Well, I enjoyed swimming. Well, I got into a lot of trouble when I was in high school inviting friends to go swimming. My friend explained to me that there was an unwritten rule that it was actually a high social crime to invite a friend to go swimming.
Weird.
When she explained to me why it was a high social crime, however, I no longer broke the rule. But no teacher told me that. One other thing, too, that needs to be acknowledged, too, is that not only did I have issues understanding unwritten rules, one thing that we really have a hard time accepting, but every kid with autism learns this in school, kids with autism are treated differently than kids without autism. There are some things that teachers consider acceptable if you are neurotypical, but do not consider acceptable if you're autistic. And oftentimes we do not realize those double standards exist. And I remember learning that double standard when I very innocently asked a girl who was in special ed alongside me to homecoming. I was lectured and disciplined so much by my teachers for daring to ask a girl out on homecoming. What I learned was that at my high school, it is a high crime for a child with autism, a boy with autism, to ask a girl out for homecoming. They didn't care that the typical boys were asking girls, but this was a high crime, and every boy with autism who asked a girl out to homecoming was disciplined for it. And so the biggest social issues I had were not only understanding unwritten rules, but realizing that there were double standards at play, and I had to abide by them if I was going to survive socially at my high school.
I liked hearing what you two had to say because it helped me focus and, add to your two examples. My son Anakin, yes, I'm a very big sci-fi fan. My son Anakin, the biggest social thing with him was kind of along the lines of what James was saying, in that he's not antisocial, but he chooses when he wants to be social. And that was very clear from a young age with him. And our school system, certain teachers in particular, had it stuck in their brains that everybody has to have a group of friends. You have to be social, or it means you're going to be depressed and suicidal. There was no in-between here, especially if you were special ed. Now, if you were neurotypical and just happened to be shy, no problem. But if you're special ed, you've got to be social. And he just wasn't at that level. And, one of the things that I actually wound up, finally educating his main teacher about, this was in high school. My son has very thick, curly hair that when it grows, it piles on top rather than going down. And he has a disorder called neurofibromatosis, and one of the common symptoms is they have a larger than normal head. And his teacher would periodically come to me, especially in the winter, and ask me, when are you going, she'd do this via email, when are you going to get his hair cut? And I would say, is he violating dress code? Which I knew he wasn't. And she'd say, well, no. I says, well, is it unclean? She says, well, no. I says, well, then what's the problem? Well, if he looked more normal, he wouldn't get teased. And when I read that response, I was like, okay, I've got to sit here for the next 10 minutes and calm down before I write a reply, or I'm going to get into big trouble. And I finally, in a very long email, explained to her that it's not my son's responsibility to look normal to prevent himself from being teased. That's the school's responsibility to teach the bullies not to tease and teach them to appreciate diversity. This isn't about, make it life easier. If they look more conventional, more conservative, then somehow that'll help people overlook the disability. That's totally the wrong approach in my mind. And, I explained it to her, and I finally ended the email with a question. I said, if my son was not special ed, would you even be mentioning this to me? And she wrote back basically a single line of, I'm sorry, you're right. And I still have that email because I like it when I can politely change a teacher's mind and change their perspectives, which are usually based on their whole education, their whole social thing. And when I asked my son why he didn't like getting his hair cut, in the winter, he had a very logical, reasonable answer. He's like, Mom, it keeps my head warm. He hated hats because they were always a little too small because his head's a little bigger than normal. And I looked at him and I says, well, that's perfect. So now he gets a cut in the summer, and that's about it. I never had a problem with the school, with his teacher again. And, this is a persistent thing. They always tend to stereotype and make assumptions as to what he's going to be good at based on a diagnosis or a test score. And my son is a whole lot more than a test score. I remember when he was transitioning from Head Start, and at that time we would be transitioning into Ashland school system because we weren't living in Washburn at the time. And we were at the first, IEP, and one of the people there, he was a school counselor, he looks at me and he goes, Mrs. Lamson, you're just going to have to accept that your son is retarded. Now, I wasn't outraged over the use of a specific word. The word is irrelevant. I don't care what they call it. It was the absolute attitude behind it that we have written him off and he's not even started public school. We've already decided in our heads that this kid, we're going to make him go through the motions because the state requires us to do so, but he's not going to be part of our school community the way other students are. And that's the attitude I have fought with politeness, with fact, with logic and rational thought the entire time my kids have been in school.
Thank you for being so honest and vulnerable about those challenges. What I'd like to give you the opportunity to share on now, if you'd like, is maybe a positive experience in the school system. It could be in a classroom or in a school-based setting. Can you tell maybe what helped your child or yourself to learn? What specifically was helpful in your circumstance?
I'll start. Okay, I'll start. And I just want to acknowledge that stereotyping is also a huge social impediment. And the old saw of once you know one person with autism, what everybody, you know one person with autism. So please don't assume from what you've experienced in the past that the people who are coming into your life will be the same as other learners. I also want to say why Nick is not here. So he was also invited to participate in this panel. He said, and quote, I don't want to be considered a human with autism. I want to just be considered as a human being. So he hasn't really experienced the sting of social stigma. And again, I think there's something protective about his perspective. So he's been sheltered and accepted. We're in a good place, but I think those days are ahead of us. So what has been good? good things have been really good experiences have come through really insightful and devoted and skilled adults in his life. The adults that set up a lunch bunch with just buddies. It didn't have to, not IEP kids, but just a lunch bunch. And that was something really to look forward to for him. And formed the bonds that carried him through high school. So that lunch bunch was about connection and about commonality. And I am all about diversity, but I'm also all about finding common ground. And I think that's where the strength of social emotional learning is going to happen. You have to have a connection. And so that's, to me, the very foundation of social emotional connection that was nurtured in those lunch bunches that just got to be friends hanging out together.
One of the things that defined the social order in the local school districts that I was growing up that many of the teachers had a hard time accepting was that there actually was a way in which a person with autism could be accepted, but not in the way that the teachers were willing to acknowledge or understand. Acceptance was very much gender-based where I grew up. And there was kind of a basic principle that if you had autism, your same gender socially shunned you, but your opposite gender took you in. So when I was in high school, all my friends were pretty much female. While I had guy acquaintances, pretty much the people who wanted to hang out with me outside of school were girls. The people who talked to me outside of school were girls. And one of the things that actually made those friendships work was that we were very aware of how these social mandates in our society, these unwritten social rules, were stifling our friendships. All this push towards segregating us because I was a guy and they were girls. We saw how our friendships were being stifled, and we all united over what we thought was this common enemy, these neurotypical mandates to segregate us, when to us, we were friends and we were going to defend our friendships as much as possible. And what was positive about it was that having to fight against our teachers who wanted to separate us, our parents that sometimes wanted to separate us, made our friendship stronger because we realized we had to present a strong front against all these forces that wanted to split us apart based on gender differences that we thought were basically just really minor. To the point where one of my female friends concluded that our challenging the gender segregation for our friendships was fighting an injustice no different than challenging the racial segregation of the 1960s. That's how fierce we felt regarding challenging this segregation. But at the same time, it was a positive thing. It gave me a social life. It gave me friends. Because it didn't matter that I had autism, and they didn't. We had a cause, and we were going to unite over that cause. And that really helped me get through a lot of my social struggles, because basically my female friend said, here's what we're going to expect of you socially, but here's what we're going to tolerate from you, because if we're going to fight for this cause together, we're going to create a way so that we will interact with each other. Because if there's one thing my female friends and I also realized, we couldn't go anywhere if we had any issues. Because if we went to any adult, if we had any problems, they'd use that as an excuse to separate us. We had to help each other and make sure that nothing ever got between each other, because no adult would ever rationally help us. So that was what positively, even though it came from some negative forces by teachers, helped me socially in school.
I've got a tale for each of my 2 kids that's a positive tale. For my son, he was a member of the school district's choir since 5th grade. And his senior year, his choir director got in touch with me, and he told me that every year the choir and the band go on a trip during spring break. And that my son's senior year, they were going to Disney in Florida for almost a week. Now, I've been to Disney because I lived in Florida for a time. And I knew that there's just no way with my finances that I'm ever going to get him there. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And the choir director was absolutely adamant. He says, your son can do this. I want him on this trip. And what we wound up doing is they said, well, a staff member needs to go with him, which I completely agreed with. I would not have wanted my son running around Disney alone. No. I don't know who would have been annoyed first, Disney or him. But they didn't have a staff member, because they got to work. And I said, well, no self-respecting 18-and-a-half-year-old wants to go running around Disney with his mother. No, that's not going to work. Fortunately, he has an uncle that is younger than me and had never been to Disney. And it was like sending 2 teenagers to Disney who could take care of each other. And he had an absolutely fabulous experience. The other choir students had taken him under their wing and protected him. And his best experiences in high school were with that choir. And he absolutely loved it. I remember every year I would ask Mr. Olson, the director, I says, are you sure he's okay? Are you sure he's, fitting in and everything? He says, I wish all my students had the enthusiasm that my son has, and he absolutely loved that experience, being in the choir and then going to Disney and such. Now for my daughter, Marina, her best experiences, positive experiences, was when the School for the Deaf, which she started attending when she was a 6th grader, finally realized that she had autism. And they're like, well, why wasn't this noticed before? 2 reasons. One, she's very typical female autism, which I just realized back in a conference earlier this year actually existed. And the fact that she is severely hearing impaired. Her local school district pretty much made the assumption that if my daughter was showing any sort of social emotional oddities and difficulties and such, oh, it's because she's deaf. Everything is because she's deaf. And I heard that so many times, and it finally, I got her to a place where everyone is deaf, and they realized, well, we're going to tease out the fact that, she didn't really learn communication very well before this. Once they got over that, they're like, oh, she screens as mildly autistic. And they have been doing things to help her. She has a social group that they have during lunch and other places, and it's all a normal, she can do so much more there because her hearing loss is no longer a barrier there. And they can work on the things that do need to be worked on. So she's become a much more confident and, self-reliant individual, both socially and life skills-wise, than ever before. So those are my 2 tales.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes, I think. So I want to give you guys a chance to touch on 1 or 2 things. We've talked a lot about the social side of development. We haven't touched much on emotional development and those coping skills that can be so critical. So if you could touch on either that emotional side of things, those coping skills, or if there's anything else that you think would be really valuable for the to be able to learn from you or your children's experience, you can touch on that as well.
I have so much that I wish I could share with you, but I want to focus on anxiety management because my experience of autism with my child has been the 3 A's of autism: autism, anxiety, and attention. So regarding anxiety management / coping skills, teach the skills explicitly, break them down. There are a number of good sources and curricula that you can use. And you have to teach those coping skills and the anxiety management before the learner needs them. You cannot teach anything once cognition starts because anxiety is so high. NICU has had a lot of teaching and even biofeedback where he's hooked up to a computer where he's learned to bring his nervous system down to a more reasonable level. So it involves deep breathing, visualization, progressive deep muscle relaxation. So any kind of anxiety management tool that you can teach your learner, I think is helpful. In real time, when I see him start to percolate and escalate, I have to be very mindful and take those 2 seconds to calm myself down, not escalate to his level, and we have a catchphrase, a key phrase, okay, let's have a redo. And so then he can start thinking again and use those tools that he's developed over the years. So anxiety management taught before the skills are needed.
One of the things that also has to be remembered is that anxiety management does not necessarily mean the elimination of anxiety in a person with autism's life. One of the things that is very difficult for many teachers and professionals to understand is that the basis of successful social functioning for people with autism is actually through a pretty painful process internally that many adults and kids with autism have to go through. And that is that when you're autistic, your brain instinctively is wired to behave in a way that society has deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, offensive. But I can tell you 90% of the time when you see a child with autism behaving inappropriately, it's because their brain told them to behave that way based on their reasoning. So in order for a person with autism to behave appropriately, they have to learn how to fight their internal brain instincts and override what their brain is telling them to do. And in my case, I've learned that the less anxious I am, the more I insult and offend people. Because the less anxious I am, the more my brain wants to behave in those instinctive ways. And every single behavior that is instinctive in my brain offends somebody, insults somebody. I have to override every instinct in my brain to function. And the only way I really can do that is if I am constantly anxious. Because if I'm anxious, I am more willing to override those instincts to function. If I am less anxious and more confident, I am more likely to offend and be ejected from a social situation. So my message to you now is anxiety management doesn't mean necessarily eliminating anxiety.
For me, I think the main thing I'd like, for this room to take back with them is that the whole idea of one size fits all, one methodology fits everyone is utterly and completely false. And I think that holds true for not just the autism community, but for all of us as human beings. But it's especially important for kids who have struggles, whatever those struggles may be. What works for autistic kid A may not work for autistic kid B. That other kid may need something completely different. And being able to look at each individual student is absolutely critical. And I know it's hard, especially in larger school systems where teachers have way too many students to deal with, especially if more than one of them happens to have special needs. It's really a hard job, but school districts at school systems at every level need to start focusing on really making an IEP actually individualized and not just applying, okay, this student is autistic, we use these methodologies, or this student is deaf, we'll use those methodologies, and not looking at the whole, that individual as an individual. Think just because there's one main problem, that doesn't mean everything else is related to that main problem, because often it's not. Dual diagnosis or triple or quadruple or whatever, multi-diagnosis is extremely common with almost any disability. There's always something else there that is affecting and causing even more problems. And if you're thinking, oh, well, it's just her communication issue and all you're dealing with is her communication, you're not dealing with the rest of the problem. It's not effective. It's not efficient. So I think we really need to work on developing systems that allow for that level of thinking, that, philosophy of let's look for everything. Let's look at this person as an individual person and not as a collection of diagnoses that we fit prepackaged, solutions to.
Wonderful. I just want to thank you guys. What we as professionals can gain from your lived experience is just tremendous. You were willing to come up here and be vulnerable and honest about your experiences, and your experiences can only make us better in working with those that come after you. So thank you so much. You guys help me thank these guys.